The year was 1975, and Alain Delon was at the height of his international fame. But he was about to embark on the most dangerous project of his career, a film that would expose the inner workings of the Union Corse, the secretive Corsican crime syndicate that controlled drug trafficking, protection rackets, and political corruption throughout the Mediterranean. The project, tentatively titled Blood and Honor, was intended to be Alain's most serious and personal work. As a man of Corsican descent himself, he understood the culture of honor, loyalty, and vendetta that defined the island's criminal traditions. But he also believed that the romanticized image of Corsican bandits needed to be confronted with the brutal reality of modern organized crime. "I want to show the world what these organizations really are," Alain told his producer during the initial planning meetings. "Not romantic outlaws living by ancient codes, but brutal criminals who use tradition and family loyalty to justify exploitation and murder." The script, written in collaboration with investigative journalist Jean-Claude Izzo, was based on years of research into Union Corse operations. It detailed how the organization had evolved from traditional Corsican banditry into a sophisticated international crime syndicate with connections to drug cartels in South America, money laundering operations in Switzerland, and corrupt politicians across Europe. What made the project particularly dangerous was its authenticity. Unlike previous crime films that relied on stereotypes and fiction, Blood and Honor named real locations, described actual methods, and included thinly veiled portraits of living crime bosses who were still active in Union Corse operations. The first warning came through François Marcantoni, Alain's longtime friend with connections to the Corsican underworld. During what seemed like a casual lunch at a restaurant in Ajaccio, Marcantoni delivered a message that had been carefully crafted to sound like friendly advice. "There are people who are concerned about your new project," Marcantoni said quietly, choosing his words carefully. "They feel that it might present an unfair picture of Corsican traditions and could damage the reputation of many honest families." But Alain understood the subtext immediately. This wasn't a request, it was the first step in what would become an escalating campaign of intimidation designed to force him to abandon the film. "Tell your friends," Alain replied calmly, "that I'm not making a film about honest families. I'm making a film about criminals who hide behind family honor to justify their crimes." Within days of this conversation, the pressure began to intensify. Anonymous phone calls started coming to Alain's home at all hours of the day and night. The callers never made direct threats, but the message was clear. They knew where he lived, they knew his schedule, and they were watching him. The calls were followed by more subtle forms of intimidation. Alain's car tires were slashed while he attended a dinner party. His mail was tampered with. Strange men began appearing near his home and office, always careful to stay just far enough away to avoid being confronted, but close enough to be noticed. The psychological warfare was expertly orchestrated. The Union Corse had decades of experience in applying exactly the right amount of pressure to convince their targets that cooperation was preferable to continued resistance.
But they had made a fundamental miscalculation about who they were dealing with. The first direct threat came in the form of a letter delivered to Alain's production office. Written in the formal, old-fashioned language that Union Corse used for official communications, it was polite in tone, but unambiguous in meaning. "Monsieur Delon, you are a son of Corsica, and we respect your achievements in cinema. However, your current project shows disrespect for our traditions and our families. We strongly advise you to reconsider this path for the sake of your own honor and safety." The letter was signed with the traditional mark of the Union Corse, a small drawing of a Corsican dagger surrounded by olive branches. Alain's response shocked everyone who knew about the situation. Instead of backing down or seeking protection, he called a press conference and announced that he was accelerating production on Blood and Honor and would be releasing additional details about Union Corse operations that had not been included in the original script. "I have received threats," he told the assembled journalists, "from criminals who think that intimidation will silence the truth. They are wrong. Every threat they make only proves how necessary this film is." The press conference sent shockwaves through both the entertainment industry and the criminal underworld. No major public figure had ever openly defied the Union Corse in such a direct and public manner. The crime syndicate's response was swift and escalating. Within hours of the press conference, Alain received a phone call at his home. The voice was calm, educated, and spoke with the refined Corsican accent that indicated high rank within the organization. "Monsieur Delon, you have chosen to make this a public matter. That was unwise. We had hoped to resolve this quietly, out of respect for your Corsican heritage, but you have forced us to consider more direct methods of persuasion." The threat was no longer subtle. Alain was being told that his life was in danger. The escalation continued over the following weeks. Professional surveillance teams began following Alain's movements, documenting his schedule with military precision. His phones were tapped, his mail intercepted, and his business associates were approached with friendly warnings about the dangers of continued association with him. The crime syndicate began spreading disinformation about Alain's motives, suggesting through their media contacts that his real goal was personal revenge against specific Corsican families rather than legitimate artistic expression. They portrayed him as someone who had betrayed his own cultural heritage for commercial gain. But what the Union Corse didn't know was that Alain had spent months preparing for exactly this confrontation. His research into their operations had revealed something that the crime syndicate had worked hard to keep secret. They were vulnerable in ways they had never been before. The modern world created new weaknesses for traditional organized crime. International banking regulations made money laundering more difficult. Improved communications technology made it easier for law enforcement agencies to coordinate across borders. Most importantly, the global media could turn local criminal disputes into international incidents that attracted unwanted government attention.
The first phase of Alain's counterattack came through channels that the Union Corse had never expected. Instead of going to the French police, who they knew had been infiltrated by their informants, Alain took his evidence to Interpol and the newly formed European Anti-Organized Crime Task Force. Working with investigative journalists from 3 countries, Alain had assembled a comprehensive dossier on Union Corse operations that included financial records, photographs, recorded conversations, and detailed organizational charts showing the hierarchy of command within the crime syndicate. The evidence he provided was devastating. Financial records showing money laundering operations through legitimate businesses in Monaco and Switzerland. Recorded conversations detailing drug trafficking routes from South America through Corsica to markets across Europe. And most damaging of all, documented connections between Union Corse leaders and supposedly legitimate politicians and businessmen across the Mediterranean. But Alain's most powerful weapon was something the crime syndicate had completely overlooked: his international celebrity status. Every threat they made against him became international news. Every attempt at intimidation was reported by journalists around the world who were fascinated by the story of a movie star taking on organized crime.
Television news programs began running special reports on the Union course, using Alain's conflict with them as a hook to explore the broader issue of organized crime in Europe. Newspaper editorials praised his courage while condemning the criminal intimidation he was facing. The international attention created a cascading effect that the Union course had never anticipated. Government officials who had previously ignored their activities were suddenly under pressure to take action. Law enforcement agencies that had been content to monitor the situation passively were forced to launch active investigations. The Union course found themselves in an impossible position. They couldn't back down without losing face, but every action they took against Alain only brought more attention to their operations and more pressure from law enforcement agencies across Europe. The situation reached a crisis point when Alain announced that he was not only continuing with the film, but was also writing a book that would detail everything he had learned about Union course operations, including the names and locations of current leaders. The crime syndicate realized they had been outmaneuvered. Their traditional methods of intimidation had backfired spectacularly, turning their target into an international symbol of resistance to organized crime. But the final blow came from a source that no one had anticipated. Through his research, Alain had discovered that several high-ranking members of the Union course had been embezzling money from their own organization. These crimes violated the traditional codes of honor that the syndicate claimed to uphold, and provided Alain with leverage that even the crime bosses couldn't ignore. In a masterstroke of psychological warfare, Alain sent a private message to the Union course leadership through François Marcantoni. The message was simple. He would reveal the names of the embezzlers to the organization's own leadership unless the threats against him stopped immediately.
The crime syndicate faced a nightmare scenario. If they continued threatening Alain, he would destroy their organization from within by exposing corruption in their own ranks. If they killed him, they would face massive international law enforcement attention and lose all their political protection. The surrender came through the same channels that had delivered the original threats. François Marcantoni arrived at Alain's home with a message that was unprecedented in Union course history. "They want to meet," Marcantoni said, his voice filled with amazement. "Not to threaten you, to negotiate a peace treaty." The meeting took place at a neutral location, a private dining room at the Hotel Hermitage in Monaco. 3 high-ranking Union course leaders attended, men whose names had never been spoken aloud by law enforcement, but whose power was legendary in the criminal underworld. The atmosphere was tense but respectful. These men had come not as conquerors, but as representatives of an organization that had been forced to acknowledge a fundamental shift in the balance of power. What happened in that room remained secret for decades, but the results were immediately apparent. The threats against Alain stopped completely. More importantly, the Union course sent word through their networks that Alain Delon was under their protection, not because he was working with them, but because they respected his courage in standing up to them. The crime bosses had been forced to do something they had never done before: publicly acknowledge that they had been defeated by a single individual who refused to be intimidated. The broader implications of this agreement rippled throughout the criminal underworld. Other organized crime groups took note that even the powerful Union course had been forced to back down when confronted by someone who understood how to use modern media and international law enforcement as weapons. Blood and Honor was completed and released to critical acclaim and commercial success. The film presented an unflinching look at how traditional Corsican codes of honor had been corrupted by modern criminal enterprises, while also showing respect for the legitimate cultural traditions that the Union course had exploited for their own purposes. More importantly, the information that Alain had gathered during his research led to dozens of arrests and the dismantling of several major Union course operations across Europe. The international attention his conflict had generated had given law enforcement agencies the political cover they needed to launch comprehensive investigations. The ripple effects continued for years. Banking regulations were tightened to make money laundering more difficult. International cooperation between police agencies was enhanced. Most significantly, other public figures began speaking out against organized crime intimidation, knowing that Alain had proven it was possible to resist successfully.
The most shocking revelation came years later, when François Marcantoni revealed what had actually been said during the Monaco meeting. The Union Corse leaders had not only agreed to stop threatening Alain, they had formally apologized for underestimating his courage and had requested his permission to use his film as an example of how someone could stand up to organized crime with honor and intelligence. They told him, Marcantoni later recalled, that he had shown them what real Corsican honor looked like, not the corrupt version they had been using to justify their crimes, but the authentic tradition of standing up for what you believe in, no matter the cost. The irony was profound. The crime syndicate that had tried to intimidate Alain into silence had ended up learning a lesson about courage and integrity from the man they had threatened. The story of Alain's confrontation with the Union Corse became legendary in both the entertainment industry and law enforcement circles. It demonstrated that organized crime, no matter how powerful, could be defeated by someone with enough courage, intelligence, and media savvy to turn their own tactics against them. Today, law enforcement agencies around the world use Alain's strategy as a template for how public figures can resist organized crime intimidation. The key lessons: never negotiate from a position of fear, use publicity as a weapon, and always have more information about your enemies than they have about you. The Union Corse never threatened another major public figure. They had learned that in the modern world, celebrity status could be more powerful than any traditional form of criminal intimidation. For Alain, the experience reinforced his belief that artists have a responsibility to speak truth, even when that truth is dangerous. Blood and honor remains one of the most authentic portrayals of organized crime ever put on film, precisely because its creator had faced the reality of criminal power and refused to be silenced by it. If this incredible story of courage triumphing over criminal intimidation inspired you, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that even the most powerful criminals can be defeated by someone who refuses to be afraid. And tell us in the comments, would you have the courage to stand up to organized crime to defend your principles? Because sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons, but with truth, courage, and the refusal to be silenced.